Welcome to today's show, folks. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Richard Nicoletti. I'm your host, Brooks Robinson. This is Cortland Hooked, the podcast. One of the ideas Ricky had going into 2025 podcast was a whole series dedicated around fly line technical information. And I thought it was a great idea in terms of that this would probably be, part one of maybe a 4 to 5 part series. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Maybe more if we need to do it. And I don't want to have a super techie podcast where we're just going to lose people, right? So I don't want to say it's going to be basic either, because it's not going to be basic. So I want to get into kind of the technical aspects of, I guess, how we build a fly line or what's in fly line. And some things I will talk in, general terms of like all fly lines that are on the market, right? Most of the time it'll be pretty specific to Cortland. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I just wanted to be clear before we start, as far as like, this isn't an advanced technical part 1 of 5 series fly line invention type stuff. So like if you are, a beginner, an intermediate, or even advanced level angler, and you just, you're not into the weeds of how everything's built, like you're not going to get lost here. Okay. So
yeah, the entire idea is just to, as a fly line company manufacturer, we have 90 different tapers products out there on the market.
Yes.
And as you know, as an experienced fly fisherman, you can pretty much make any line work for any situation. It's just what does it better and why. And the whole goal of this series is just to for you guys that have looked through our website, looked through the cold salt series, the specialty series, the trout series, just being able to look at what you're fishing, where you're fishing, and find the line that makes sense and is going to actually help you versus like it will work, but
for sure,
what can really happen
there. And we have 90 different tapers, right? And it's probably close to being accurate.
Yeah.
But when you start to involve 90 different tapers, and then you have various cores of monofilament and braided nylon, and then you have various grades of plastics, right? Hard plastics, supple plastics. Then you get into densities, lines that, float, hover, intermediates, type 2, type 5 sink rates. And then you get into, grains and line weights. And then you apply those across all those different tapers, and you end up with, an insane amount of options. Mm-hmm. Okay. So hopefully that the part 1 and part 2 and so on of these podcasts will help you, I guess, be better educated as far as why you would choose a certain line for certain circumstances, certain methods, certain fisheries, certain weather conditions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, basically relying less on what, as the manufacturer, what we write, what the line should do, you kind of grabbing it from like the back end where it's like, that makes sense. Why they wrote that about this line. Like
a good example would be, up here in the summertime in the northern United States, July and August, it's hot, mm-hmm. right? It's 80, 85, 90 degrees. And, we would always use tropical lines to bass fish, right? Yeah. Because you build tropical fly lines for 80, 85, 90 degrees. So like maybe after, part 5 of the podcast, like I'm kind of maybe jumping the gun here, but you would have that ability to be like, well, if that line's built for that type of conditions, then I know I'm going to use it in that type of conditions. Or maybe you have a line that is for that specific type of fishery, right? In those conditions, but you want to apply it for something else, but it doesn't say that on the box or the mm-hmm. line. And you're like, this makes sense to me. And you try it and it works good. So hopefully we get that part of the education of how things are built, why lines are built, the ins and outs, and you can make those educated decisions on your own if you needed to. There's a lot of anglers that have lines sitting around the house in the garage, and they didn't realize that they could utilize that for something else, even though it doesn't scream exactly what it's supposed to be on the box. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
So I think we start with the part 1 series with the core, right?
Yeah.
Of the lines. That's essentially where everything starts, right? Every fly line needs a core, okay, regardless of what brand it is, you know. So let's start with cores, okay? So long and short of it, there's typically 2 types of cores, okay? There's monofilament cores, and then there's braided nylon multi-filament cores, okay? So for the most part, monofilament cores are used for lines that are clear tips, and there's different grades of mono, meaning like suppleness and stiffness, harder monos. Mm-hmm. Braided nylon cores are typically used for more supple lines. And then there's ways to tweak those cores, which I'll get into, which kind of covers some of the additives and tweaks that we do to the cores to make them either stiffer or more supple, right? Yeah. So, and stop me at any point in time if you want to kind of really go into more detail of something if I don't go over it properly. So, like I mentioned, 2 types of cores. Let's start with monocores, right? So we have 2 different types of monocores that we utilize. We utilize a supple monofilament core that you would put into lines like the clear camo, clear intermediates, clear tips, lines that would be utilized in cold or cool and warm conditions, okay? And then we have monofilament cores that are more of a medium hard stiffness rating that we would use in tropic intermediate lines, tropic ghost tips, okay? And tropic floating lines, okay? So the difference in the 2 is you want to start with a core that has the right environmental usage for it, right? So I want to use a supple core in monofilament that we're talking about that's going to be used in conditions where it's cooler, right? And I want to use a harder monofilament core that are going to be used in conditions which are tropic, okay? So we're able to use those 2 different cores based on where that line is going to be used. So if you're looking at some lines that are utilizing monofilament cores and they have ratings for cold water or warm water, just know that that's probably going to be utilizing our softer core versus lines that are rated for warm to tropical are going to be used for a harder core. And when you get into the braided nylon cores, you have some ways that you can tweak those a little bit too. So typically those are used in the vast majority of lines that are going to be supple and used in cooler or warm conditions, like trout lines, right? Very few times are you going to utilize a tropic line for trout fishing, with the exception of maybe some tailwaters, right, where the water's really ice cold. And, you know, the boat deck and the outside air temps are 80, 85 degrees. So braided nylon cores are typically used in almost all, you know, trout or cold water type lines. But one of the things that we can do at Cortland is we're able to tweak some of those braided nylon cores with additives in our primer process. So I can actually take a braided nylon core and stiffen it up to get it to react like a harder mono core would. And we would do that in certain cases like the 50 plus lines, the extra strong core lines, lines that would get the grip set technology. So essentially, I don't have to build a tropic line using a monofilament core. I can use a braided nylon core, but get the stiffening agent in that to get it to react just like a hard monofilament core. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we'll have another part 3 or 4 series that gets into plastics and PVCs and different grades of durometer pressures of how we can apply those to the cores I just discussed. But before I continue, like one thing that I feel like I have to throw in there before that other series comes is, so I talked about the cores, the stiffness, the suppleness of both the 2 monofilament and braided on. We can tweak those a little bit by the PVCs that we put on them as well, which is something that we'll get to in the other series. So don't just think that those cores, like that's what they're rated for, that's what they can do, those are the conditions they're supposed to be fishing. They will get altered a little bit based on the jacket material that you put on them. Okay, so handling differences, like I said, softer cores, monofilament braided nylon, ideal for cooler weather conditions, warmer weather conditions. The harder cores are ideal for your warm to tropical conditions. And the plastics that we would put into those as well, like those are going to conform to their environment as well. So we start with a harder plastisol for tropical conditions. We start with a more supple plastisol for cooler conditions. Okay.
But so, in general too, though, it's like, yes, you could have a stiff monocore and a stiff braid core, but it's really like you really notice a difference in just like natural characteristics of just like memory and plastic.
Yeah, that was actually the next point that Ricky wrote most of this show, by the way. I don't let Ricky write a lot of shows, but he did a nice job with this one. And it's a great segue, even though you're not looking at the paper that I am. So it like characteristics of these cores and how they react in those environments, right?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
And just the, in general, I feel like before we get into this, you have a lot of people that have fished a monofilament core in the past and they had a bad experience with memory or tangling issues. And it's like, well, was it the right line for the right temperature?
Sure.
Did you stretch it, handle it, spool it the right way?
Sure.
And we know from just loading a fly line on a reel, if you do that incorrectly, you will twist in your line before you even cast it.
That line probably will never be fished correctly after doing that.
So really, like, you really to wrap your head around, did the monocore fail me or did I fail the monocore? You have to be able to cross off these potential issues that could have come up along the way that you just weren't, educated on. And like, I see it because I try to push the limits of some of our specialty series lines, like the compact series range, which is like our dual temperature range, warm,
most
cold.
Versatile that you can get.
Yeah, yep. It won't get sticky on me in the summer, but
won't coil on you.
Won't coil on me, in 60. But
there are still limits to it, but
when I'm fishing that clear, compact intermediate and it's like 40 degrees, we're muskie fishing. If I roll out on the boat, I lay it out on the deck, it's 40 degrees in the morning. And that reel sat there with the line around it for the last 4 months because I haven't been doing that type of fishing. It's going to retain memory. It doesn't matter how warm it even if it was a 70-degree day, it's still going to show memory.
There's always memory, a little bit of memory, right? Even the most supple lines, like typically a lot of the supple lines we make, they sit on smaller arbored reels, right? Larger the arbor the reel, the less memory that line's going to want to have.
Mm-hmm.
But when for people just getting into the sport or even guys that, have been into it for a little bit, when you pull fly line off the reel, when you start the day, there's a good chance you're going to see a little memory in that line. That is totally normal.
Mm-hmm.
That almost should happen. You don't want to have a line that's so damn supple, it has zero memory off the reel. That'd be ideal, but it is nice to have just a little bit of bounce and stiffness in there, right? So
for stability going through the guides too.
Yes.
That's huge.
That's kind of my point. So, the handling characteristics of these. So monofilament, it will want to retain a little bit memory, especially as it gets colder,
mm-hmm.
right? Braid core is much less. However, you can't have a clear intermediate or a clear tip line with a braided core. That's typically why those are built that way.
Yep.
So in order to counter that memory a little bit, you can run that through your hands with just a slight stretch. You do not need to hook your fly line to the back of your truck and lean on it and stretch on it. Right?
From a tree.
Yes.
We've heard crazy.
Because all you're doing is you're really stretching that plastic jacket on it and you're pushing the limits of that. So that would be the last thing I would do, is overstretching a line would be the death of the long-term lifespan of that product.
It's like stretching for like doing a sport. I mean, like
you can overstretch.
I do, you could overstretch, but you could also not stretch. I mean, we do flag football every Thanksgiving, and
it's a great analogy.
When I do not stretch, the next 2 weeks, I'm like, holy crap!
Scott's nodding his head over there. Scott, I'm almost 40.
You can't. Everything needs to be stretched, and like,
a little bit.
Even like the father of fly fishing, Leon Chandler. That was like one of his biggest take-home points was you need to stretch your fly line every time. And when we say stretch, it's more of like a relax.
You're warming it up a little bit.
And when you go 3 feet space, the line will give you about, I would say like a quarter, half inch of movement.
A little bit, yeah.
But you feel it and it bounces back. And then you go to the next section, feel it. Just boom,
so
boom,
you can
boom.
relax it a little bit. The worst thing I've seen is when people see that their line, it looks like memory, but it's honestly twist. And it could be twist because you improperly spooled your reel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or it's twist because of your casting style, which is totally normal. Like I have like a 45 coming back and an over the top vertical, right? I'm almost throwing like a half hitch into every cast.
Yep.
And it happens a lot when I striper fish or streamer fish, and I don't clear the line that's on the deck all the time. And now I'm diligent about it, where every 10th cast, I'll clear the line. So what happens is when you do that is when you strip that line back in, you can essentially get like a little bit of that twist in those rotations out of the line.
Yep.
My point is sometimes what you're looking at maybe on the deck or in the boat or even on the bank, you're like, man, my line's got a little bit of memory and I'm going to stretch this. You might be setting twist into the line.
Yeah.
So always at first clear your line, okay, and then slowly strip that thing in and see if that takes it apart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if you're a guy that is like, listen, my casts are so dialed, I don't throw twist in my line, but this line got twisted and this line didn't. Well, it could be your fly. I mean, I have like bass poppers and or even crippled dry flies. When you're throwing, 7X, 6X for tailwater fish on the Delaware
with light tippet,
and you have a 15, 17-foot leader.
Sometimes the leader will show the twist before it reaches into the fly.
Oh, yeah. You bring in your fly and the whole thing, and like it looks like you lost 6 inches of tippet because the whole thing twisted. And that's mainly because of sometimes casting, but a lot of times is like some of these cripple patterns that have one wind
or bigger flies. That's I usually try
bigger
to
flies
use
with lighter tippet,
a barrel swivel when I can to get that twist out. If I'm able to, right? Not all fisheries allow you to have a barrel swivel just because of a stealthier approach, but I'll try to utilize it as much as I can. So just some insight as to, cores and the environments and what you can do to prolong the life of that and make sure that it's being utilized properly. And you'll see that in some of those, the braided nylon cores that we add the stiffening agent, like that will show a little bit of memory right off the reel. That's normal. It should do that a little bit. It's just, how do you go about relaxing that line to get it to where it needs to be to perform? So a couple of the other things is, the densities between the two. Mono is typically a little more dense of a material than braided nylon, right? So there's some factors in that, as far as like sink rates and stuff that we'll get into on our next podcast of, lines that will sink a little bit better than others, but there's handling characteristics that you have to kind of like weigh those options based on where those lines are going to be fished. So some of the technologies that we utilize in the cores, like the extra strong core, for example, right? Like we only utilize that in a handful of lines for certain reasons. We really introduced the extra strong core to be used in certain lines that are used for targeting species that require those types of things, right? Yeah. I don't need an extra strong core in a 5 weight if I know I'm going to go target 16-inch wild trout. Okay?
Stopping power,
exactly. So typically you'll find those in lines like our Pike Muskie series, okay? Or like the striped bass series, where hey, I'm going to be fishing, an 8 and 9 weight because that's about what I think I need to be targeting with these fish based on my fly pattern. But there's a chance you're going to hook into an absolute beast, and you want to have something capable of hook setting properly, stopping power. There's also an abrasion resistance factor, for saltwater jetty type fishing.
You're fishing heavier leader. Correct.
So, and you might say like, well, why don't you do that in everything? So the extra strong core typically, this is, to get kind of nerdy, is we will make braided nylon multi-filament cores, but we'll utilize larger deniers in those cores, but with a looser pick count. Okay. What that does is it elongates the core as opposed to a high pick count where you're jamming a lot of picks per inch, which would make a really nice round core, which would be ideal for like conventional fishing, right? Like a nice good pick count for conventional fishing to go through your guides where it's not super light and airy, prevents a lot of wind knots. But in this case, it allows us to basically keep the same diameter core of what would go in that line with the regular size or regular cores, but have a much better break strength. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's a correlation between core size and overall jacket material on the outside, right? If you have a super large core with a thin jacket material over the top and it's a floating line, typically that line's not going to want to float, right?
Yeah.
There's additives in the jacket material that allow that line to float. So when you reduce the amount of jacket material over the core, you're not going to be able to get those characteristics to get that line to float. So my point is that when we build lines and line sizes, 3 weights and 8 weights and 12 plus weights, there's a certain core diameter that correlates with about how much jacket material will go on that to get the right weight.
Right weight, right, density.
Right weight, right density. Yep. You don't want to have a super tiny thin core and a super large jacket material. Typically those lines, they won't even cure properly during the process. So there is a balance between core size and the jacket material or plastisol, whatever you want to call it, that goes over the top of that. Does that make sense?
It does. And one thing I want to talk about, because we get these questions all the time, more so for saltwater fishermen, guys that are tarpon fishing, and they're catching, they're going for 100 pounders, they're going for 130 pounders in the Keys, and they ask you, they're like, what is the core strength of your liquid crystal 11 weight? And you tell them 35 pounds, and their mind is like, what do you, 35 pounds? I'm catching a 150 pound fish. And people need to understand too that the weight of the fish in water and the amount of heat you're putting on that fish with a fly rod and techniques of how to apply pressure to not only whoop the fish, but to not overfight it, to not just drag out the fight and wait for the fish to basically kill itself because you're not putting enough heat on it. It's mind-blowing when you first see it. And I'll never forget when I first started working here, I think he was going down to Costa Rica and he brought in a blue water rod. I think it was a 15 weight. And for some reason, I think you had your hunting boot here, and the boot weighed less than 2 pounds. And I remember he tied a piece of, I think it was 50-pound braid. It was something, I think it was like master braid or something. And we couldn't lift the boot off the ground with the rod in the air.
Straight pull.
And that really, in my mind, just like put in perspective.
I think what you're trying to get is
how little pressure the core is there for durability, longevity, but like you're not, if you catch a 20, 30 pound striper on a 25 pound core, 30 pound core,
you're not maxing out.
It's not like they equal the same thing.
Yes, you're correct. You're 100% correct. And we do get asked a lot, like the 50 plus series lines, which we can get into, like the GT line we first came out with the 50 pound braided nylon cores. Those fish, we did that, one for durability and abrasion resistance, and 2 for stopping power. But kind of back to what you were saying before is core strength and fish size don't necessarily correlate, because the amount of pressure that you're actually applying to that fish is nowhere near what you actually think it is. And a good example that I can give you is when I first started fishing in the Keys, I would always go with homeboy Francatino, and he is an IGFA leader stickler, right? And we would fish 16-pound class tippet. Maybe 20, but most of the time 16.
Gosh.
And the first tarpon I ever hooked with him and our boy Willie Lee on the boat, this fish jumped, and it was over 100 pounds. But I'm thinking to myself, I had 16-pound class. I go, there's no possible way this thing's coming home.
Yeah.
But after you get a few of those chances and those events happen where you're fishing, and I fished down to 12 with him before, you don't realize how much pressure you can put, and even a straight pull, not lifting the rod and bending the rod. I'm talking reeling down on the fish, pointing the rod directly at the fish, and literally pulling straight back like you're trying to break it off on 16-pound tests. It's almost hard to break them off.
You can't.
With 16, and at that point, it's all 16-pound class tippet. That's the final straw, right? So when you factor in, 35-pound cores on liquid crystallines or whatever the line is, right? Plus 30 for a certain size when you have a bend in the rod and a little stretch in the line and a little stretch in the leader and maybe the lines in the water, there's so many factors that go in that have nothing to do with like core strength versus how big the fish is. It's
leader size.
It all depends on how much pressure you're actually putting on that fish in those instances. So I didn't want to get sidetracked with it. It was a great point.
No, but the only thing I want to say too is I feel like with cores, like the only time you expose a core that's maybe undergun for a fish is either when the fish eats right at your rod tip and there's no stretch or no give.
You have no rod bend.
Or something happens with your reel. You get jammed up. Line gets wrapped around your foot. Line gets wrapped around a pole. And there's no give at all. And it's like literally like
there's a shock
It's like
factor.
You put a brake on your reel.
Yep.
And you see that, salmon fishing, the moment a client locks the reel,
it's over.
It's over.
And
so like that goes into it, just understanding like as long as you let the line do what it needs to do, even if you feel like you're getting dogged, you're over compromised, the fish is doing too much to you, do not lock the drag. And if you do, make sure you got a core and make sure there's not a weak point in your line before that it reaches that fish.
A good example that if you don't truly understand what we're trying to explain, what you could do is get a buddy, have him run out 90 feet or 80 feet from you with the fly line in his hand. You don't even need a hook and a leader for this situation. And grab like an 8, a 9, or a 10 weight and have him run out about 80 feet. And try to put heat on that line and pull on that and then reverse it and you go do it. When you realize how hard you're pulling and someone's like 80 feet away, like the amount of pressure that you would feel in your hand, it's crazy. Mm-hmm. And then there's certain ways to fight fish, you know what I mean? And that's not what I'm going to get into, but core strength and pressure are two totally different things. So
it is. And it also just the overall abrasion factor too. Like you mentioned 50 plus, the whole 50 plus series. Like I think of the Los Locos boys in Mag Bay. The amount of fish that they lost due to line failure breaking this year, I think it was less than like one hand.
Sure.
And they told me that a majority of the breaks didn't come within the line. It became with a connection between the backing and the fly line, where maybe the backing dug into the fly line and cut the line, depending on if they use like a solid spectral braid or something like that. But what they did say was overall that 50-pound core, when those fish came up, which are striped marlin and roosters, and they were rubbing against the bottom of the boat, and that's where having a stronger core and like a beefier core really plays into a factor of like it can take a little more abuse when you are chasing those fish that are going to put you through it.
For that, the 50-pound, the 50 plus core series of lines, it's a core that we first utilized in the billfish sinking and the GT lines, and it is a braided nylon core, and it has the same characteristics of the builds I described in the X-Strong core, but obviously it's beefed up a little bit, right? So it's a lesser of a pick count. It's a higher size denier per each denier versus like a standard core, but it's not monofilament. So monofilament, you can make a 50-pound plus core out of mono, but there's an abrasion resistance factor, right? So when you're fishing for GTs, and this is how it really came about, is they will burn you through coral, okay? So having that braided nylon core is much more durable in those instances than a monofilament core, okay? So that's really why we started utilizing the 50-pound plus braided nylon cores for those types of fish. And back to what I said earlier too, is we're able to tweak that stiffness of that core with some of the additives that we put in it, so it acts and reacts like a tropical line, but not utilizing mono. So it's something that is unique to Cortland. I think for those instances, it's the perfect ideal balance of having a super strong core with good abrasion resistance. It's not going to break when it goes over coral. It's much more durable, and that particular core, it's not perfect for every fishery or every line. Just for those certain scenarios, it is the right way to go. what else you got for core stuff that I haven't gone over as of just yet here?
Just really hammering the idea that understanding why we put certain cores in certain lines. If you have questions, like reach out to us, ask us if you're looking for core strengths because you're trying to push the limits of a line, or say you have some tropic lines and you see some blue water stuff that you have an opportunity to jump on a boat for. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask us. We'll tell you straight up, we think you should go with something else.
It does happen a lot. Guys will try to utilize a line, and kind of goes back to when I first started the segment of just like, there's lines sitting around guys' houses and garage, and they're just like, maybe I could use it for this. Maybe you know what I mean? You're right. Just reach out. We'll tell you if that 9-weight tropic line that we have that you want to utilize for bluefin tuna in Cape Cod, probably not going to be a good idea. It's a good thought, right? It's hot. It's August, and I can use it here. There are some limitations to core sizes for certain fish. When you really start pushing the limits of cores, what the vast majority of listeners probably won't do. And if you are going to push the limits on your gear, I would highly suggest spend the money and do it correctly.
Yeah.
There's a good chance you're going to be spending some good money to either hire somebody, fuel on a boat, a big reel, a big rod, more leader material that you aren't used to purchasing because you need to beef it up. Don't skimp. Like, if you are going to go on one of those trips, I wouldn't say of a lifetime, but there's a chance of getting something really cool, really unique, and having a badass experience. Don't skimp. It's a once in a lifetime chance sometimes for some people. I know when I get a chance to go tuna fishing, I bring a fly rod. My guys get pissed because they don't even want to see the damn thing, but I make sure that I have, jacked up hollow core backing. I got the 50 plus series lines on there. That thing's spliced and whip finished by one of my buddies at the tackle shop that knows what he's doing. The leader is the same way. The knots are tied perfectly, because if I do get that chance, I'm not screwing that thing up.
And the only other thing I wanted to mention quick is, if you're starting to question whether or not you need to find a heavier core for your fishing, whether you're in Australia where they have those what are those? The Murray cod. Like, those things are like
barramundi.
They eat right at the boat sometimes, and then those are situations where you're going to want to beef up your core because, number one, is there structure around? Are you going to have to stop that fish from going into a rock pile, into going into a down tree? Just look at your settings. And that's why, what we just talked about, why the extra on cores and the musky stuff and the pike stuff, is because sometimes when that fish grabs, it might eat 50 feet out the boat, it might eat 10 feet out the boat, it meet right at your rod tip in the figure eight. You need to have a core that's able to just take that immediate wham, that shock. And then, God forbid, you get hooked up in a situation where you probably you knew you're going to be in trouble if a fish eats, and it does eat, and you have to stop that fish. That's when you want a beefed up core. You need to make sure that you stop that fish from turning around, and it doesn't pertain to every situation,
No, I was just looking at this. Like, the vast majority of core strength, it's not super important. It's specifically
like trout fishing, like mousing. If you're mousing at night and you're like, you know what, I'm gonna go catch the biggest brown trout in this river at midnight tonight with my buddies. Okay, say you're going with a heavier leader because it's night and the fish can't see it. But you have an opportunity to catch, you're on the White River, you have the opportunity to catch a 30-inch trout. What is that fish running into once you hook it? It's open water. Sure. So your streamer float line that has a 25-pound core, even if you're catching a 30-inch, 12-pound brown,
plenty sufficient.
If you have to put that much heat on that fish where you're going to break the core, something else wrong happened. Something else bad happened. So
I wouldn't read too much into core strength for the vast majority of the listeners, just because most are trout fishermen. That's never going to come into play. It's really when you're just targeting species that are on another level in terms of speed, body size, scenarios like you mentioned, pike muskie fishing, structure, right, jetties and coral, stuff like that. So kind of to wrap it up, a couple different types of cores: monofilament, braided nylon, variations within those: supple monofilaments, hard monofilaments, soft braided nylon with the stiffening agent for those scenarios, like Extron core grip set, other things like that. Handling characteristics that are going to be a little bit different based on the core that you're using and the environment that you use it in. I don't really have too much on cores other than that. I will say that there's probably a ton of questions for listeners that probably don't even know what cores are in the certain line. There's a good chance where it doesn't really matter. If that line functions properly for you and it doesn't coil and the line floats and it's supposed to, don't read too much into that. But again, the part one of a multi-part series is, really getting into the weeds of where the fly line starts, right? Which is core. And then, part 2, 3, tapers, densities, plastics,
and
weights, right? So probably a part 5 series. So anyways, make sure that you stay tuned to all these different series of getting into the weeds of how fly lines are built. If you have any questions on what we discussed today as far as cores, give us a DM on Instagram, Facebook, shoot us an email, info@cortlandline.com. Make sure you guys follow along with our podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcast. We usually throw up clips through Instagram and Facebook from time to time, either in our stories or direct posts to kind of keep you posted. I think this podcast will probably rip it probably early March or so like that. And then I think probably our cadence with the part series might be a little quicker than usual podcasts just because we want people to not get strung out so much and lose track. And honestly, I'd really like to make sure we do as much education as we can for this series prior to, peak season of, tarpon fishing, trout fishing and stuff like that. Because once guys get into May and June, guys got what they got and they're ready to go and they're on the water. So stay tuned for more of the multi-part series of how fly lines are built. Thank you, Richard, for being my co-host today. Thank you for listening. This is Cortland Hook, the podcast.